So we got this JSX code here, which is basically HTML code inside of JavaScript. Indeed, JSX stands for JavaScript XML, because HTML in the end is XML, you could say. So we got this HTML code in JavaScript. And again, this is really important. This only works because there are transformation steps running behind the scenes because of this process, this npm start process which we started, which transformed this JavaScript code to more browser-friendly code before everything is being served here. And indeed, you can see that transformed code if you want to. Simply open up the developer tools, and here I'm using Chrome, which is the browser I do recommend for development. Simply open up the developer tools in Chrome by going to View, Developer, Developer Tools, or by using that shortcut. And in these developer tools here, go to the Sources tab. And this shows all the sources, all the script files, for example, which were downloaded as part of this page. Now, in here, you'll see a couple of folders, but you should see some static/JS folder or something like that, which should hold a couple of JavaScript files. Now, the exact number and names of these files might differ, but ultimately, if you click through these files, you should see some code which looks fairly cryptic, and which is definitely not the code we wrote here, or we have here in these two simple JavaScript files. Well, it turns out that this is this transformed code, and it's quite a complex code, as you can tell, because React supports many features, and this code does not just contain our source code, but the whole React library source code and the whole React DOM library source code. So the code in these files is not just our code, but the entire React package code. That's something to keep in mind. Now, in these files, in the main chunk.js file here, for example, you see a function named app. Somewhere in there, you might need to search for it with Control F, but somewhere in there, in these files, you should find your app function. But of course, this function looks quite different to the app function we have here. That's a very lean function. This function is not so lean. Well, in the end, that's this transformed code, you could say. That is that code which runs in the browser, which is not the code we wrote, but that's what this code is transformed to. And if you have a look at this transformed code, and even that look might change over time, but it will definitely not look like this. If you have a look at this transformed code, that probably is not code we would like to write. And that's why we have these transformation steps. Because we can use this special JSX syntax, which is not normally supported in the browser, whilst we're writing our code, and still it'll automatically be transformed to code which does run in the browser. So that we have the best of both worlds. Code which works in the browser, which obviously is important, and code which is easy to write for us as a developer. And I'm just putting so much emphasis on this because that can be super confusing if you're new to React. You do know some basic JavaScript, at least you should, and all of a sudden you see code like this, which is not regular JavaScript. Well, this is just developer-friendly code which we can write, which is transformed behind the scenes. Okay, so enough about JSX and all of that. Let's now really get our hands dirty. We have this HTML-ish code here in this app function. And we have that code here because with React, we ultimately build our own custom HTML elements, as you learned. We build those components, and a component is basically just a custom HTML element. And we do that with this declarative approach, as I mentioned, which means with React, we define the desired target state, and React is then responsible for generating and running the actual DOM instructions which update what's visible on the screen. And we can see this here. This here is our desired target state. We want to, in the end, render a div with a h2 tag with this text inside of it on our screen. Because in index.js, we render this app component, this custom app HTML element, you could say. And inside of this custom element, which turns out just to be a function, more on that in a second, inside of that, we in the end just return this HTML code. So therefore, ultimately, it's this HTML code which is rendered on the screen. And that's indeed what we're seeing here. Now let's tweak this code a little bit. And here in app.js, in this function, in this returned HTML block here, let's add a paragraph where we maybe just say this is also visible. If you add this and save this file and you have this development server running, which you should, it'll automatically pick up this change. It'll notice when this file changes, and it will automatically update what you see on the page. And therefore, we now also see this text here, this paragraph. So that's how we can work with that. And we can just define that we want to have a paragraph here. Now, keep in mind, in regular JavaScript, you would kind of select the element on the page, for example, with document get element by ID root, as we're doing it here. But then you would not be done. If you then want to add a paragraph, you either set the inner HTML content to something, or you first of all create a new element with document create element, creating a paragraph, and then you got your paragraph here like this, and you would set the text content to this is also visible, and then you would reach out to some place in the DOM and then simply call append or append child and add this created paragraph. That is how you would do it in regular JavaScript. And this is called imperative. This is following an imperative approach because you are giving clear instructions, clear step-by-step instructions what JavaScript and the browser should be doing. Now, this works, but it can get cumbersome. For complex user interfaces with dozens or hundreds of elements, which also might be changing and appearing and disappearing all the time, having to write all these instructions is very cumbersome. With React, instead, we just define the desired end state, that we want a div and a h2 tag and a paragraph, and React will then generate these instructions behind the scenes to bring that onto the screen. That's how this works behind the scenes. Now, I did mention, of course, that for all of that, React embraces this concept of components. And as I also already mentioned, we do have our first component here, app. So this function in the end, as it seems, in app.js is a component which is used like a custom HTML element here in index.js. Let's now build up on that and let's build our first custom component. And since we ultimately want to build that expense tracker, let's also build our first component in the context of this expense tracker. Now, to work towards this expense tracker, let's again think about the kind of components we got there. And you might remember that in the end, we were able to split up this simple looking application into a bunch of components. In the chart, we had the individual chart bars, we had the individual expense items, we had the form for adding a new expense, and therefore we get a bunch of components and a bunch of components we could get started with. Now, why don't we get started with the expense item though? So this row where we have the title and the amount and the date of an expense. And therefore we now want to build our first own component. Now we could add it here in app.js, but it is considered a good and best practice to actually put new components into new files so that you have one file per component. And that will mean that in React projects, you will end up with dozens or hundreds of files, because in React projects, you'll have dozens or hundreds of components in the end. And that's absolutely normal. Now, to organize our source code a little bit, here in the source folder, I'll add a components folder, which will hold all these component source files. Now, I will not move app.js in there because this app component will be a special kind of component. Not regarding its code, that will be the same code as you see it in all the other components, but regarding its role in the application. It will be our so-called root component, which means it's the main component being rendered here in our starting file in index.js. And all other components will be either nested inside of app.js or nested inside of other components, which then in turn again are nested somewhere else. Because ultimately with React, we build a component tree, you could say. You have this main app component at the top, and then below that you could have any other kinds of custom HTML elements, so other kinds of components, which in the end hold other pieces of the user interface. And big applications, therefore, of course, can result in quite big component trees, where only the topmost component is rendered directly into the HTML page with help of that React DOM render instruction. All the other components will not be rendered with this instruction, but instead will be used as regular HTML elements inside of our HTML code, inside of our components. But you'll see that all in action in a second. So inside of the components folder, I'll add a new file, and I'm using shortcuts here. You can also use these buttons, of course, for adding folders and files. And I'll add a new file here, which I will name expense_item.js, because this will hold my expense item component. Now, one word about the file name. Here again, you are generally free to name this however you want, but it's a common convention in React applications to name it like this, starting with a capital character, one word, where if you combine multiple words in one word, every sub-word, so to say, starts with a new capital character, like the I here in item. And then inside of this component, if the file is named like this, you of course should have a component that is dealing with rendering expense item data, so that the file name tells us which kind of logic and HTML code will live inside of that file. So now let's write the concrete component code in that new file. And of course, that means that we now finally have to understand what component code is. How is a component written in React? Well, we already saw it in app.js. It's just a function. And that is a key takeaway. That is super important. Definitely keep that in mind. A component in React is just a JavaScript function. A special kind of function, special regarding what it returns, that it does return this JSX code. But other than that, it's just a JavaScript function. Therefore, if we want to create an expense item component here, we add the function keyword, give it any name of our choice, though again, the convention is to repeat the file name here, just without the extension, so expense item. And then in here, we return the HTML code, the JSX code, which should be brought onto the screen by this component. So for the moment, I'll add a h2 tag here and say expense item in there. Now that's our first very basic custom-made component. And of course, it's quite similar to the app component, which I gave to you, because in the end, all components are similar. Components are just functions which then return HTML code. And of course, the HTML code you do return in a component depends on what that component should render on the screen. Of course, that's not our final HTML code for this kind of component. Now, to use this component, we need to export it. Otherwise, it's only usable inside of that file, and that's not helpful to us. So we add an export statement, which in JavaScript simply looks like this. We export this function as the default for this file. Now we can import it in another file. And as I mentioned, we're not going to import it in index.js, and we're not going to render it like this, because we only do this once for our root component. Instead, I now want to use my custom component here like a regular HTML element, so like a h2 element, inside of the HTML code written in the app component here. Hence, at the top of the app.js file, we should now import our custom component. So we simply import expense item from /components, we need to go into this components folder because that's where the file lives, slash expense item, and then without the extension. This path in the end tells JavaScript that we're looking for an expense item file in a components folder which sits next to this app.js file in which we have this import statement. Now that this is imported, the cool thing is that we can just use this like a HTML element. So we can, for example, replace this paragraph with expense item, like this, opening and closing, written like this. The key difference to the built-in HTML elements just is that it's not starting with a lowercase character, but with an uppercase character. And indeed, your own custom components must start with an uppercase character when you're using them in JSX code like this, so that React is able to detect that this is a custom component. Because the simple rule which React applies is that lowercase elements are built-in HTML elements, so it will look for them as built-in elements, whereas elements starting with an uppercase character are elements defined by you or some other developer. So this is a custom-made component, and we have to use the name which we used here in the import as a name here, because that's how this connection is established. This tells React that we want to use this component which is imported under this name from the expense item file. If we now save everything, all the files, and we go back to the browser, we see expense item showing up here, which of course is the h2 tag rendered by our own custom component, because we now created and imported and used this custom component. And it's always these steps. You create a component, which is in the end just a function returning some HTML code. You then export it, and then ultimately you import it in the file where you want to use it, so that there in the JSX code you can use it like a HTML element, just starting with this uppercase character. Okay, so we created our first custom component. It's definitely not too exciting, but it is a custom component. And we're using it in app.js. Now let's make it a bit more exciting at least. And for that, in the expense item.js file, I want to tweak the HTML code which is being returned here. Let's say an expense item should not just be some title, but we also want to display the amount of this expense and then also the date. So therefore, we want to write HTML code which nicely displays and structures these three pieces of information. Hence here, we could say that we want to have a div HTML element which displays the date later, and for the moment I'll just put date here as a placeholder. And then next to that div, I'll have, let's say, another div which actually should display the title, let's say inside of a h2 tag, title, and then also another div next to the title with the amount. Now you can see this is getting unreadable, but even worse, it seems to have an error. My IDE is complaining about this line of code. Now regarding the readability, we could try to split it across multiple lines, but that would be kind of invalid. But we have a bigger problem anyways. This code is not valid like this. In React components, there is one important rule regarding this HTML, this JSX code which you return inside of a component. You must only have one root element here per return statement, or per JSX code snippet, you could say. And here we have this div side by side with this div, which means we have two root elements here in this statement. And that's simply not allowed. Now, why is that not allowed? That's something I'll come back to in a deep dive lecture later in this section. For the moment, let's just accept that this is not allowed. And therefore, the question is how we may work around that. One of the easiest workarounds is to wrap this into another div, opening and closing. So an opening div and then a closing div. I will also show you another workaround later, but that is a simple workaround we can apply immediately. Now, regarding the readability, we can improve that by also wrapping this all in brackets, simply to signal to JavaScript that this is one and the same statement, even if it should span multiple lines. And then we can restructure this as we want to. Though the quickest way of restructuring this really is to use the auto format shortcut, which I just did. You can find this if you go to your preferences, keyboard shortcuts, and there you search for format document. This shortcut, if you press this, it automatically formats your code and makes it easier to read. And I will use this shortcut a lot throughout this course because it keeps our code readable and manageable. And now we expanded this HTML code of this component, and we now have more than just one h2 tag. And very important is that rule of having only one root element. Inside of this one element, which we return here, so inside of this main div, which we return here, you may then have multiple elements, and these elements then also may be side by side, as you can tell. It's really just the root element in a JSX code snippet, like here when we return it, which must only be one element instead of multiple side-by-side elements. But with that, we now prepared our basic structure here. Now, of course, for title, we might now say car insurance. For amount, we maybe say $249.67, something like this. And for date, we might say something like March 28th, 2021. Something like this. And if we now save this, that's what we see here. Still not looking super nice, but we can see it. And we can see that we can have more complex HTML structures inside of our components as well. Nonetheless, of course, our applications also should look nice. They should not just have some HTML code which is ugly. So let's now have a look at how we can add some basic styling here. Now, regarding the styling of our components, we still use CSS, but there is nothing too React specific when it comes to that CSS code. In the end, we can just add a new CSS file, and typically, for the CSS code of a given component, you add that file next to the component JavaScript file, and that would be the expense item.css file here. Then you want to write your CSS code in there, but since this is no CSS course, I don't want to bore you with writing a lot of CSS code, and hence you attached find a finished expense item CSS file, which you can simply download and use, or simply download it, open it, and copy the code you find in there into your expense item CSS file. Now back in expense item.js, we need to do one important thing. We need to make this overall build process aware of that CSS file and tell it that the CSS code in there should be considered and should be injected in the finished application. Because it's not by default browsing all your files and automatically including everything. You explicitly have to tell React, you could say, or that build process, that a certain file should be considered. For expense item.js, we did this with this import in app.js. For expense item CSS, we need to do that inside of expense item.js. There, we simply import /expense item.css, just like that. This simply tells the build process that the CSS file should be considered. Now, inside of that CSS file, I in the end just prepared a bunch of CSS classes which can be added to elements to apply a certain look. And therefore now on this HTML code in expense item, in our component, we need to add these classes. For example, on the wrapping div here. Now there's one special thing here. We don't type class here, as we would do in regular HTML, but instead class name. And this can be strange, but you have to keep in mind that this here is not really HTML. It looks like HTML, but it's this special JSX syntax invented by the React team. And in the end, under the hood, it's still JavaScript code. That's why most attributes are the same, but not all. And here, the class attribute was renamed to class name because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Technically, it would still work if you would use class here, but you should use class name. Now here on this overall div, which wraps everything, we then add the expense-item class here. On this div, which holds our title and our amount, we add another class name, which is expense-item __. So here we got 2 underscores, description. And then here on that div with the amount, we simply add class name and then expense-item __, price. And if you now save everything, it should look like this, which is definitely nicer. Still not the final look we want, but definitely nicer. By the way, I'm super zoomed in here to make this easier to read, otherwise it would look something like this. And that's definitely also not great, but again, it's not the final look. Again, let me zoom in closer so that we can better see that though. Now that is how easy it is to add styling to your React components though. It's really not too fancy. You have to be aware of the fact that it's class name instead of class, but other than that, it's really just standard CSS code, which then is added to your elements. And in that CSS code, you can use all the selectors you might know. You're not limited to classes, but again, I don't want to turn that into a CSS course, so we'll keep that fairly simple. This import might be the strangest thing in the end, because that is needed to make this entire project aware of that CSS file. And that's how we can style our components.